The folder looks harmless until it is opened. A few copied newspaper columns. A map of Whitechapel folded along lines that have softened from use. Police names in margins. Streets that no longer look, on paper, like places where people argued over rent, searched for a bed, bought a drink, crossed a yard, waited under gaslight, or tried to survive another night. Whitechapel, Bucks Row. Hanbury Street, Burner Street, Mitra Square, Dorse Street. The old crime journalist keeps the map under the lamp and follows the streets before he looks at the famous name. That is the better order. The name came later, and it has been loud enough for more than a century. Jack the Ripper. It is printed so often now that it can feel detached from 1888. A name on book covers, walking tours, documentaries, lectures, arguments, and suspect theories that return every few years with new confidence. But before the name became a mask, there were women in the East End of London. There were police constables, walking beats with limited light. There were lodging houses filled by the night. There were newspapers waiting for copy. There was a city that did not yet understand how quickly fear could move through print. London in 1888 was never one city, no matter how orderly it looked on a map. There was the London of empire, parliament, clubs, offices, shop windows, and men who could speak about order as if poverty were a distant weather condition. Then there was the London of the East End, overcrowded rooms, casual work, hunger, illness, and streets where a woman could be known to many people and still not be protected by any of them. Whitechapel was not hidden. Too many people passed through it for that. It was visible in the way poor districts often are, described, inspected, feared, argued over, and misunderstood. Respectable readers knew of it through reports written by people who could leave. The people who lived there did not have that luxury. That difference mattered once the murders began. The victims were not met by history with the attention their lives deserved. Their poverty became a label. Their circumstances became shorthand. Their names were printed, but the name of the man no one could catch would become larger than all of them. The wider Whitechapel murder file is not as neat as the legend. There were other murders, other attacks, and later arguments about where the true boundary of the Ripper case should be drawn. But when people speak of the canonical five, the story usually begins in the early hours of August 31, 1888, with Mary Ann Nichols. She was known as Polly. She was 43. Her life had been shaped by separation, poverty, drink, work when it could be found, and the fragile economy of lodging houses, where a bed for the night could depend on the coins in a woman's hand. Those details should not be used to reduce her. They explain the world around her, not the violence done to her. She was found in Bucks Row before the morning had properly begun. For police, the first problem was practical. A woman was dead in a street. A scene had to be understood quickly, with little of what later generations would expect from a murder investigation. There were no cameras watching the corners, no mobile records, no central forensic database. There were footsteps, patrol timings, statements, doorways, windows, carts, and the hard work of asking who had heard something before the street resumed its ordinary life. At that point, police could not know they were looking at the beginning of a pattern. That is one of the difficulties in the Nichols pages. A single murder is already terrible, but it does not yet reveal whether it is isolated or the start of something larger. The first investigation had to begin with Bucks Row itself, who had passed through, which constables were on which route, how quickly the scene had been discovered, and whether any witness had seen a man whose importance was not yet obvious. A clue in the first hours of a case does not arrive wearing a label. Often it looks like an ordinary detail until the pattern forms later. The file moves only 8 days before the next page changes the room. Annie Chapman was found on September 8 in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. She was 47, and like Nichols, she lived close to the edge of the lodging house economy. The location changed the feeling of the case. Hanbury Street was not some empty field outside the life of the district. It was a lived-in urban place, close to residents, doors, windows, and the daily traffic of poverty. That closeness unsettled people. A killer had acted where life was near. That did not make the case clearer. It made it more disturbing. If someone could move through such spaces, strike, and leave without a name the evidence could hold, then the danger did not belong only to empty streets or late hours. It belonged to the gaps inside crowded life. The journalist looks from Bucks Row to Hanbury Street on the map and sees the first hard lesson of the case. Whitechapel was crowded, but a crowd is not the same as a witness. Many people nearby does not mean one useful account. Poverty produces movement, noise, fatigue, and necessity. It also produces people who may have reasons not to speak, not to notice, or not to trust the police. After Chapman, the possibility of a pattern became harder to dismiss. It was not only that 2 women were dead. It was that the circumstances seemed to point toward a repeated danger in the same district, under conditions the police could not fully control. Patrols could be increased. Men could be questioned. Lodging houses could be watched. But the East End was not a laboratory. It was a living place, full of movement, poor light, rumor, and ordinary people trying to get through the day. The police had to work inside that world, not above it. By September, pressure was building from every side. Police were expected to reassure a frightened city with tools that belonged to the 19th century. Newspapers wanted details. Officials wanted control. Citizens wrote in with suggestions, accusations, theories, patrol ideas, rewards, dogs, disguises, and cures for a problem they did not fully understand. The investigation lived in boots, lanterns, interviews, paper, and memory. That sounds simple until one remembers how fragile memory becomes under fear. A witness may be honest and still uncertain. A man seen near a street may be suspicious, or he may simply be one of many poor men moving through a district at the wrong hour. A statement can help in the morning and weaken by evening when placed beside another. Police had to build a case from material that changed shape as soon as newspapers began printing it. The folder contains ordinary administrative paper too. Correspondence between officials, requests, summaries, public suggestions, and the dull machinery of a city trying to appear useful. Those pages do not have the drama of the famous letters, but they show something important. The case did not become legendary because police ignored it. It became legendary because attention, pressure, and effort still did not produce proof. The streets kept moving. Markets opened. Men went to work. Women searched for enough money for a bed. Lodging houses filled and emptied. The poor did not have the luxury of pausing because a murderer was loose. Fear entered the district, but so did necessity. That is why the Ripper case is so difficult to hold honestly. It is not only a monster story. It is a story about risk inside ordinary survival. Then came September 30. Some dates turn a file on its hinge. This one did. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, off Burner Street. She was 44. Not long afterward, Catherine Edaways was found in Mitre Square, inside the City of London jurisdiction. She was 46. The 2 deaths occurred close enough in time to create a question the case has never fully escaped. Had the same man killed twice in one night? The map becomes practical here, not decorative. Burner Street and Mitre Square were not separated by a great distance. But London policing was not a single seamless body. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police had different jurisdictions. In a calm case, those boundaries are administrative. In a public panic, they become timing, communication, procedure, pride, and confusion. Information has to move across lines that look simple only after the fact. The night of the double event changed the case because it suggested a killer who could move quickly through places that should have been awake with alarm. It also gave investigators several problems at once. The death of Stride, the death of Eddowes, the relationship between the two, the timing of patrols, possible witnesses, and the question of whether the first murder had been interrupted before the killer moved on. That last possibility has never stopped haunting the file. It is not proof. It is a question built from timing and circumstance. But a question like that changes the temperature of an investigation. If Stride and Eddowes were killed by the same man, the night shows not only violence, but mobility, risk, and a frightening confidence inside the city's own pressure. Mitre Square brought the city police directly into the story. It also led to one of the most argued-over pieces of the case. A piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron found in Golston Street near writing on a wall. The words, their meaning, and the decision about what to do with them have been debated ever since. For police at the time, this was not only a clue. It was a public order problem. The East End already carried tension around class, immigration, religion, and suspicion. A message on a wall, if left visible, could become more than evidence. It could become a spark. Removing or preserving, it was not a clean decision made in a classroom. It was a decision made in a city where fear could move faster than correction. That is what the Ripper case does again and again. It turns evidence into pressure. A piece of cloth is not only cloth. A chalked message is not only writing. A letter is not only a letter. Each object enters a city already prepared to make meaning from it. The Golston Street material also shows why later readers must be careful. The apron piece appears to connect movement through the streets after Mitre Square. But it does not give a face. The writing may matter, or it may have been nearby and unrelated. The decision to erase it may have been prudent, mistaken, or simply a response to the public tension of the hour. What survives is not a conclusion, but a knot. The journalist turns from the map to the correspondence. The paper began to speak almost as loudly as the streets. Letters arrived, or letters claiming to be from the killer arrived. The difference matters. It may be the difference between evidence and performance. The most famous letter, sent to the Central News Agency, and later known by its opening phrase, helped give the unknown man the name that history remembers. The signature was short enough to travel by itself. Jack the Ripper. That phrase did not solve the case. It did something more lasting, and in some ways more damaging. It gave the unknown man a public mask. Before the signature, police were searching for a murderer in Whitechapel. After it entered print, the city also began searching for a character who could speak, boast, threaten, and be imagined in every shadow. The Dear Boss letter was not important because it can be safely treated as genuine. It cannot was important because the police and press had to deal with it. A letter that might be a hoax still uses time. It demands comparison. It raises questions about knowledge, timing, handwriting, ink, and motive. If it is printed, it also teaches the public a language for fear. After the double event, the Saucy Jackie postcard sharpened that problem. Its most famous phrase, "double event this time," seemed to lean directly toward the deaths of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. That phrase is exactly why the postcard became so compelling. It appeared to know the shape of the night. But the postmark and timing have long left room for another explanation. By then, enough had moved through streets, reporters, and rumor that a clever hoaxer could also have understood the value of those words. That is the investigative trap. The more a letter sounds close to the case, the more carefully it has to be tested. Later came other communications, including writings that would become famous in their own right. Some were grotesque, some theatrical, some almost certainly false. Some remain argued over. The city received not one voice, but a chorus of possible voices, and the police had to decide which, if any, belonged to the man they were trying to catch. A murder could terrify a neighborhood. A printed letter could enter homes far from Whitechapel. It could be read breakfast, discussed in pubs, carried into offices, repeated by people who had never walked the streets where the women died. That reach made the letters powerful. It also made them dangerous. A hoaxer can write with confidence. A newspaper can amplify a false voice. A frightened city can begin to hear one man in every envelope. The police had to examine timing, phrasing, handwriting, postage, and any hint of knowledge that had not been made public. They had to do this while the press turned the letters into part of the show. A real communication could have moved the case forward. A false one could lead everyone in a circle. The letters were not side material. They became part of the machinery of the case. Each one forced the same question. Was this evidence, imitation, performance, journalism, madness, or some mixture the police could not separate in time? The old journalist pauses over that point because it changed the whole case. A man can be hunted. A persona multiplies. The signature made the unknown offender easier to imagine and harder to separate from everything written in his name. The old journalist turns to one more piece of correspondence before the file moves toward November. The Lusk communication, often called the From Hell letter, belongs in the same public panic machinery as the other disputed writings, but it feels different on the page. It was sent to George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and it arrived as more than a voice. It arrived with an object which made it harder for police and the public to dismiss quickly. The opening was blunt, "From hell." A later line, usually transcribed with its original spelling as "I send you half the kidney," gave the communication its lasting horror. The words do not need to be repeated at length. Their importance is investigative, not theatrical. This was not only a claim written in ink. It was a package that seemed to demand medical, police, and public interpretation at the same time. Was it genuine contact from the killer? Was it a hoax built to exploit panic? Was it an object that happened to enter a case already desperate for meaning? The file does not close that question. It only shows how easily a murder investigation can be forced to spend its strength, separating evidence from performance. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee reflected that pressure in another form. When people do not trust that official systems can protect them, they organize, patrol, petition, pressure, and sometimes feed the very atmosphere of fear they are trying to control. That does not make their fear foolish. It means fear itself had become part of the machinery of the case. By October, the investigation had become two things at once. The first was a police inquiry into murders in Whitechapel and nearby districts. The second was a public event made of letters, headlines, rumors, arguments, and fear. Those two files overlapped, but they were not the same. The public file had a name. It had a villain-shaped blank. It had a district respectable readers could fear from a distance. It had newspapers translating uncertainty into daily drama. The police file had patrols, statements, jurisdictional limits, dead ends, and too many men who might have been suspicious for reasons that could not carry a case to court. The difference between those files matters because the public file is the one that survived most loudly. The press did not invent the murders, but it helped invent the way the murders would be remembered. Reports could spread useful information, warn the public, and pressure authorities. They could also exaggerate, repeat doubtful claims, turn poverty into scenery, and make the killer a figure of fascination. The East End became a place many readers consumed as fear before they understood it as a community. That kind of attention changes the ground under an investigation. A witness who had read too much might repeat the paper. A man who wanted attention could borrow the voice of the letters. A rumor could move from street to print and return to the street with more authority than it deserved. Inside the police file, the women remain: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. Mary Jane Kelly had not yet entered the case, but her name waits near the end of the map, and the story changes when it reaches her door. On November 9th, the murders traditionally linked to Jack the Ripper moved indoors. Mary Jane Kelly was found in Miller's Court, off Dorset Street. She was about 25, younger than the others, and she lived in a small room, rather than being found in an outdoor public space. The change in setting mattered enough that the file seems to draw a line around it. A street scene gives police patrol timings, passers-by, carts, footsteps, public approaches, and the possibility that someone saw a man without understanding what he was seeing. A room gives different questions: entry, privacy, trust, sound, door, window, neighbors, time spent inside. Whether the victim opened the way to someone she knew, or whether the killer found another means of access. That is why Miller's Court is not only another location on the map. It changes the nature of the investigation. The earlier murders had left police trying to understand how someone could act in exposed places and vanish into streets already crowded with poverty and movement. Kelly's room forced a more intimate problem. If the same man was responsible, had his confidence changed? Did the enclosed space give him more time? Or did it simply change what witnesses could notice? If Kelly knew the man, then the case might point toward acquaintance. If she did not, then the killer had crossed a private threshold without leaving the kind of proof that could carry a name into court. The old journalist keeps the page half covered with one hand. Not out of delicacy alone, but because this is where the legend most often becomes hungry. The room has been retold as horror, display, climax. That habit can make people forget that before it was a famous crime scene, it was a poor woman's room. A small shelter in a district that offered very little shelter at all. The investigators did not have the luxury of turning away. They had to examine the room as a room. What could be seen? What could be heard? How long the killer might have remained? What neighbors reported? Which sounds were certain? Which memories became uncertain after the fear of the morning? And whether the shift indoors strengthened the pattern or complicated it? It did both. It appeared to carry the violence to an extreme that made many later writers treat Kelly as the final act. But it also disrupted some of the pattern. She was younger. The location was private. The witness problems changed. The night did not behave exactly like Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, or Mitra Square. That is what made the aftermath so unsettling. After Mary Jane Kelly, the traditional Ripper murders stopped. That fact has generated more questions than answers. Did the killer die? Leave London? Become imprisoned or institutionalized for another reason? Was Kelly truly the last victim? Or does the neat boundary of the canonical 5 reflect later sorting rather than the killer's actual pattern? Were other Whitechapel murders connected, or did the legend gather too much around one name? The file does not answer cleanly. Instead, history gives suspects. The old journalist opens another folder, thinner in certainty and thicker in argument. Names have gathered around the Ripper case for more than a century. Some came from police suspicion, some from later memoranda. Some from authors, private researchers, family stories, social prejudice, handwriting claims, medical theories, geographic arguments, and the human refusal to leave a blank space alone. Montague John Druitt is one of the names that returns. A barrister and teacher, he became part of later police speculation, especially after his death by suicide in late 1888. The timing made him interesting to some. The public proof did not make him the answer. Aaron Kosminski is another name that has never fully left the conversation. A Polish Jewish man living in the area, he appears in historical discussions, partly because senior police figures later referred to a suspect by that name or a similar identity. Later claims, including modern attempts to use disputed scientific evidence, have tried to move him closer to certainty. The broader debate has not produced a legal or universally accepted closure. Michael Ostrog was also named in police-related suspicion, though later research complicated his candidacy. And beyond these three are many others. Men with violent histories, men with medical knowledge, men who lived nearby, men named in letters. Men pulled into the case because each generation wanted a suspect that suited its own imagination. Each suspect reveals something about how the case has been handled. Druitt shows the pull of timing and later police memory. Kosminski shows the difficulty of interpreting old suspicion through later notes, identity questions, and modern claims. Ostrog shows how a name can survive in discussion even after research weakens the case for it. Other suspects show how quickly geography, profession, prejudice, rumor, and narrative satisfaction can be mistaken for evidence. The problem is not a lack of names. The problem is the distance between a name and proof. Every suspect folder opens with some pressure: geography, timing, behavior, rumor, a later recollection, a possible skill, a suspicious death, or a detail that seems to lean toward the file. But pressure is not closure. A suspect can look possible without becoming proven. A theory can be careful and still fail. A theory can be dramatic and still tell more about the era that produced it than about the man in 1888. The Ripper case invites the wrong kind of confidence because it feels as if it should have a final door. A doctor, a butcher, a sailor, a local man, a gentleman, a foreigner, a policeman, a royal conspiracy, a lunatic hidden in plain sight. Each version says something about the fears of the people telling it. Victorian London gave the case poverty, class anxiety, anti-immigrant suspicion, and public panic. The 20th century added psychology, profiling, and conspiracy. The 21st brought online archives, DNA claims, and arguments that can move around the world before the evidence has been read carefully. The old file accepts attention. It refuses certainty. That is where the final third of the case has to become colder, not louder. The suspects do not fail because they are boring. They fail because the evidence will not carry them all the way to the dock. A date can make a name interesting. A later recollection can make a file look alive again. A disputed identification can reopen an argument. A modern claim can make headlines. But none of those things is the same as a prosecution that can survive cross-examination. The reasons are not mysterious in a romantic sense. They are practical. The technology of 1888 could not preserve and compare evidence the way a modern investigation might. Witnesses were working from fear, distance, poor light, and memory. Police forces had to coordinate across jurisdictions while the streets kept moving. Newspapers carried useful warnings and damaging noise in the same columns. Letters and hoaxes gave the case a public voice that may not have belonged to the killer at all. Suspects appeared, but the bridge from suspicion to proof kept breaking before it reached the other side. That is why the case has lasted. Not because there is no material, there is too much material. Streets, letters, names, timings, memoirs, police comments, public rumors, suspect files, later claims, and arguments over the arguments. The archive is crowded. What it lacks is the one thing that would have ended the crowding: proof strong enough to make one name final. After Mary Jane Kelly, London did not simply return to what it had been. The murders had exposed conditions that existed before the name: overcrowding, poverty, women living close to danger because daily survival left them exposed, and a district too often treated as a problem rather than a community. Fear made distant readers look east, but looking was not the same as understanding. In the decades that followed, the case became scholarship, tourism, entertainment, obsession, and industry. Each generation brought its own tools and its own appetite. One generation looked for moral failure, another looked for madness, another looked for conspiracy, another looked for forensic certainty in objects that had passed through too much time and too many hands. The folder remains on the table: a map, newspaper clippings, police references, the disputed letters, the name written again and again because the public learned it so easily. Jack the Ripper. The old journalist folds the Whitechapel map back along its worn lines. Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Dutfield's Yard, Mitre Square, Miller's Court. The places sit close together on paper. A finger can cross them in seconds. History has spent more than a century failing to cross the distance between those streets and a proven name. Near the edge of the folder, 5 names remain quieter than the signature, but stronger than the legend when the file is read properly. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. There is no final confession accepted by law. No trial transcript where the real man answers to the charge. No piece of evidence that can be lifted cleanly out of 1888 and made to settle every dispute. There are only the records that survived. Makeod, the records that failed, the words that may have lied, and the streets where the case began before the name took over. The lamp goes out over the map. The question remains where it has always been. Not in the fog, not in the signature, but in the space between what history preserved and what it could never prove.